It's not clear whether the failure of innovation in the Canadian business is worse than the failure of hockey in Toronto, but let's not talk about it now.
Okay, so in September 2021, on the campaign trail for that election nobody wanted, the federal Liberals made a promise for a $2 billion advanced research agency, a Canadian DARPA, or a CARPA, if you will. Fast forward to April 2022, and the Liberals' federal budget, CARPA's gone, to be replaced by a Canadian Innovation and Investment Agency. And then after that, not a peep. Until last month, when the federal government unveiled the Canadian Innovation Corporation, now a $2.6 billion program over 4 years, with $1.3 billion of that going to absorb IRAP. So it's now bigger and smaller. Oh, and we might not see this new Crown Corporation in action until 2024. How did all of this come to be? More importantly, who can we get to answer these questions for us? Well, last August, when BetaKit was sniffing around for these answers, there was only one name that we kept hearing: Dan Breznitz, co-director of the Innovation Policy Lab at the University of Toronto, and by all accounts, one of the main architects of the CIC. And in his own words, with his work for the federal government now over, Dan Breznitz is unmuzzled, able to speak, mostly freely, on how the CIC came to be, what was wrong with the Canadian DARPA plan in the first place, and why Canada has such a problem with innovation. He also lays out what he thinks is missing from the CIC, who he thinks might make a great CEO for the new Crown Corporation. Doesn't seem like he wants the job. Unlike most of our guests and its hosts, Breznitz speaks in complete paragraphs on this podcast. So I hope you enjoy how he lays out how this multi-year process to create, well, this new multi-year process that is the CIC came to be. Let's dig in. I guess the best place to start is when BetaKit first spoke with you around, I believe, August of last year. Our writer, Charles Mendel, was speaking to you about innovation and our federal government, and you said that the first step is admitting that you have a problem. So I think where I want to start is what you think Canada's problem is with innovation, or when it comes to applying innovation.
Sure. Yeah, I think I even talked to Charles even before August, so right after the budget, when our minister, Christia, actually admitted that, finally. So let's be blunt about it. We as a country are extremely good in what I would call invention. So coming up, the act of actually coming up with good ideas, very useful ideas. We're horrible in innovation, which is not the action of coming up with the idea, but it's the action of coming up with the idea and making it into reality. Either as new products, which too many people obsessed about that, but actually if you want economic growth, this is, I wouldn't say marginal, but it's just one-off. To making products better, merging them with one another. Just think about what we do now, you and I on Zoom and other programs. 10 years ago, you and I will do everything in our power to avoid having this podcast teleconferencing, because we'll need to go to a specialized room with extremely expensive equipment, and the final product will be awful. And yet, up come COVID, and we all moved to Zoom or Teams. It's not as good as having coffee together, but we managed to run schools and universities and work. And that is because you have millions of hours of engineers constantly innovating and improving an array of technologies that I won't bore you with, but everybody probably knows them.
Is this purely commercialization or the iterative process of improvement?
No, that's, I think, where people get confused. It's the act of saying, okay, I have an idea. It can be an improvement. It can be a new idea. It can be a combining of few ideas. It can be an idea of how to produce something better. But I'm not just writing a paper. I'm not even just writing a patent and then selling the rights to that idea. I'm actually employing this idea in reality. And we in Canada have been extremely bad in doing that. And I will go even further. If you look since 96 at our private business sector, not our university sector, not our research sector, not our schooling sector, our businesses of almost all kind, apart from what we call startups, they have disengaged even with knowledge, meaning that they don't even employ more and more educated Canadian with the jobs where you actually use us Canadian better. We have become less and less sophisticated compared to our peers. And you can see that in our median wages, in the number of hours Canadians need to work in order to just get the same quality of life that our parents have. And that's a horrible problem. It's structural, and it's been with us for at least 30 years. And we have not admit that. We constantly say, okay, we'll just tweak it with one program, everything will be great. And no, it's not that our businesses have for 30 years basically done everything that they should in order to have profits, but almost nothing they should in order for Canada to actually prosper. We just don't admit it. We're Canadian. We're nice. We don't have problems.
Okay, so what's the root cause beyond failing to address it? Is this just a pure investment in R&D? Is this a systemic thing when it comes to federal support? Like, Canada is also unique in, I think, looking to governments to kind of structurally solve problems here, where in other economies, it's a little bit more kind of market driven, individually driven, but there's also larger pools of capital. What's preventing us other than our, maybe unwillingness to address the issue? What's the root cause of that issue?
Okay, so first of all, we are not that unique in terms of the government needing to intervene here. Okay, if you go to Economics 101, even if you ask hardcore sort of neoclassical economists, they will tell you that in innovation, because it's very uncertain, the risks are high, and the main reason why we like innovation, what in technical term would call positive spillovers, meaning I don't get all the gains, much more of society gains over prosperity. You should not expect private businesses, entrepreneurs, and companies to innovate to the level that you want in society. They'll always innovate less. And that's why you have, even in a place like the United States, changing of rules that created what we call venture capital, SBIR, SBA. I'm not even talking about the last few programs of Biden. We are not unique. What we are actually unique is never admitting that Canadian business will suffer from the same market failure. So we did a set of programs that sort of, even my friends in the University of Chicago Economic Department were puzzled, right? Because we put a huge amount of money into our university, starting at 96, into our university system, created the best and most highly educated workforce in the world, some of the best research infrastructure of the world of invention. Then we have done nothing up to the level of basically R&D tax incentives. That happens by definition after a company decided to innovate, it can get tax incentives. And somehow we imagine that magically Canadian companies can tap to this cutting edge research by universities, professors, which are globally leading, and mysteriously, without any risk and uncertainty, understand how this is going to help their bottom line. It never happened anywhere in the world. I don't know why we imagine it would happen in Canada. Second, we have created a system since 96, and I'm saying 96 on purpose. You might remember there's a thing called NAFTA, which now has a name that nobody knows what it is, but it's a trade agreement with the US. We moved to a system that actually created, and globalization with China, a huge amount of incentives and the ability of many Canadian corporations to get very high profits, actually profits, but margins that are as good as any of our peers, without investing in R&D, but also without buying the new technologies, so capital equipment, software, all the rest. Not surprisingly, that's exactly what you should expect corporations have seen their bottom line and the profit goes up, and they could not understand why they should take more risk and invest more in order to have more profits. They don't need it. Once you start this process and you let it run for 30 years, you created a business model in which most Canadian corporations in almost every sector, again, apart from startups, I want to make that clear, apart from the sector that its business is the creation of new technology, after 30 years, don't even know how to engage with innovation. And you see it in every measure that you want, patent, R&D, but also the Human Development Index. We used to be number 1 in the world. We are now number 16. And everybody who was in the top 5, apart from Canada, stay in the top 5. And this is at the same time that we Canadians have become the most educated people in the world. And we have an amazing immigration policy that brings the most educated people here. We have created incentives for the business sector to use this in order to actually buy less technology and innovate less, because we are so overqualified that we can use all technology and equipment and still be just productive enough for those profits. Okay? That's what we need to change. So you need to change why business don't innovate. You need, if you want to call it, incentivize or bribe them to innovate.
We have the wrong systemic incentives to achieve our potential, but then also it seems like because we've had a system that hasn't been doing that for so long, we have now reinforced a culture of not pursuing it.
It's culture, but also all those people that are now in the C, CEOs here, have been growing up in that culture. Even if they want to, they actually don't know. And the people below them don't know. So it doesn't appear in the business plans. Our analysts that decide whether it's smart for a company to do it or not, when they see a lot of expenditure on R&D and new equipment, they said, no, that's risk. Boom, we mark you down. We need to change the whole system, and we also need to educate the whole system that this is important if we want our children to be as prosperous as us. If you don't care about your children, well, you should be very happy right now. High profits.
All right, I think you are proving, sir, why we were so eager to talk to you on this podcast. So, but let's get to this innovation agency, and I want to include maybe the background here, the level of involvement you've had in crafting it or providing recommendations, and before we discuss what it is now or what was announced most recently, the original promise of a Canadian DARPA, and you were initially against that, but I want to maybe have you connect that response to how you've had such a leadership role or a public-facing role to the point where federal agencies, when we wanted to reach out to them in conversation about this, told us that you were the point person to speak to. How did you get roped into this process?
By mistake.
Okay. It was all a terrible mistake. Okay.
Yes. So, and I'll be blunt and tell you a story. So it turns out that there is a position in the Department of Finance called the Clifford Clark Economist. And you look at its mission statement, official mission statement, and Clifford Clark was a very smart man. It says somebody that comes to the department in order to bring new ideas and new thinking. Very broadly defined. So the idea is that you bring somebody from the outside, right? You have extremely smart people, but they need to be exposed for ideas. And then you bring somebody, and there's been a list of people vastly smarter than me in the past that, they basically disturb the shit, if you will, and talk to people and open their minds. It wasn't filled for 12 years since Harper. I would let you decide why it wasn't
we'll just
filled.
let that slide on by. That's a whole other podcast conversation.
Yes. But then I was asked, COVID was raging, and I was asked, do you want to come and help? We actually want new thinking. We're in COVID, and we really want to have new thinking before we open up the economy. In the beginning, I was torn, but then I said, look, every morning you see only one face in the mirror, and that face is yours. It's Canada. We're in COVID. I have been harping on how we're doing badly for at least 7 years now. I know Michael Sabia. I know Christia. I think that there is a chance for a change, again, because of COVID. If I say no, then I will feel that I did my public duty, right? I harp and harp and harp. But when people ask me, okay, so are you willing to join the team? So I joined the team. I had zero expectation that we'll be able to do anything, right? You know the stories about Ottawa.
I might be, having lived there for 8 years myself, I might be a little familiar. But then I also know that when it comes to Ottawa, what is announced and what is launched are very different. And the goalposts have really moved on this, because prior to the budget announcement last year, we have to go back to the initial campaign promise all the way back in 2021 of a Canadian DARPA. I would assume at that point you were around and engaged when the federal government made that. What was your issue specifically? Because I think you co-authored some op-eds about it. Like, why was a Canadian DARPA the wrong approach?
We are now rewinding back. I'm still not in government, because in government you don't write op-eds. So this idea comes, and by the way, this is not a new idea. It was the latest fashion. The US created several more DARPAs, which nobody heard about in the last 10 years. So even the US is not very successful with DARPA. The UK created a DARPA, which I think already proved to be a disaster. But even more importantly for Canada, it is the wrong solution for a problem we don't have. Okay, the pure DARPA, if you really look at what DARPA does. What DARPA does, and there's a D in the beginning.
Yeah, this is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, for anyone unfamiliar.
Yeah, and people like to forget the D. And it's basically a very small agency in the context of the US that says we need to think outside the box on new technologies on the battlefield, so we can be prepared on the battlefields for multiple things, because our enemies, back when it was USSR, are actually more advanced than us. And this is the hedging. And therefore, we are going to develop technologies that are going to help our defense. An example, people talk about the internet, but let's talk about the latest one is mRNA. There's a small company you might heard about. They created a vaccine. It's now called Pfizer, Moderna. They've been working with DARPA for over 20 years on mRNA technology vaccines, because the idea was that if you send soldiers all around the world, they're going to be exposed to strange viruses. You need to be able to very quickly develop a vaccine, maybe even experimental, inject, and they can still fight.
Particularly if we're fighting aliens.
You're right.
I've seen the movies.
Or fighting whoever the US decide to fight.
Yes, okay. When does the 5G technology get involved with the...
Yes, exactly. When did they install the chips? But more importantly, two things happen here. You're now talking about an agency which is going to give even more money to blue sky research and new invention, which is actually what Canada is doing quite well with. And the end result of a DARPA, and I used Moderna as an example, is something that takes hundreds of millions to several billions, just to read the reports on rap speed, and 6 to 20 years before you're going to have anything that you're going to sell. Think about those lovely robots that Google likes to send to us every Christmas, videos of, and New Year. That's 20 or 30 years. Now, look at the Canadian business. Do we even have a business that can take, let's assume our DARPA is successful, that can take the result of this research and invest in it for 20 years before they can see any profits? And the answer is no. I mean, the world would love Canadian DARPA, because what would happen is, to that vacuum, multinational corporation will step in. They already are stepping into Canada. We can talk about it later. They will take it. They will develop it. We created prosperity and jobs and better welfare for the world, but not for Canadian. And it does not solve the real problem. Canadian business are not engaging with innovation. If we don't admit that this is a real problem, we're not going to have the right solution. DARPA, it's a great idea if we had already an extremely successful R&D business sector, and we just want to kickstart it so it would really compete. but we are not there.
I will just note here, point taken, but I think CARPA would have been a much better acronym than the CIC. So I'm saddened that we lost that. But you would, in pushing away from a CARPA, Canadian DARPA approach, you had recommended more falling in lines.
You mean CRAPA, right?
Well, it depends on how you organize the acronym. I could have gone a couple different ways, right? But you had recommended us following, I believe, both an Israeli or a Finnish model to this. So what was your proactive recommendation of a new focus? Because I believe this gets to the point of the tension where we're going to ask questions of like, why has this been taking so long? And what is the CIC and what has it become? But there was a mentality shift here, and maybe you can inject some of the other country models that we should be looking to follow, if not the US DARPA model.
And by the way, it's not just me, okay? I mean, I think that you ask almost any one of the top people that are interested in that, in both finance and ISED, they would have told you that we have a different problem than the US. I mean, it's really lovely, and I appreciate it that we want to think that we are competing with Americans. We are not competing with Americans. We don't look like the American economy. So instead, we said, okay, what is the problem that we have? Why, for 30 years, we constantly fail in innovation and the median wages go down? And that's the problem that needs fixing. Okay. How can we think about other countries that we would want to imitate or model upon that manage to solve that problem? Not the problem of looking cool, but the problem of our business sector. And very quickly, there's only very few of those countries that have done it in the last 30 or 40 years. You mentioned Israel and Finland. It's also Taiwan. We also talked with other European countries, especially Scandinavians, for reasons that I think should be obvious, because unlike the US, we also like to have an equality and equity in our society and not just make sure that the rich get richer.
I thought you were going to say hockey, but fair points. There's a variety, there's a demographic profile that overlaps in a couple different ways.
Exactly. And we also do have hockey, at least in the rest of the country. I'm not sure about Toronto, but we should not go there. It's a sad, tragic. It's not clear whether the failure of innovation in the Canadian business is worse than the failure of hockey in Toronto, but let's not talk about it now.
I'm a Canadiens fan, so this is purely enjoyable to me, sir. I have no issue with you slandering the Maple Leafs on this podcast. So then these other countries, what is their approach that we're looking to mirror here?
Okay, so their approach, they're much humble than us. And I just want to explain, DARPA that is not necessarily a bad idea. The model just does not fit the problem we have. And we also discovered that Canada has a problem, and that problem is programs. We have 180 different programs. Each one of them is very narrowly focused on something, and claimed every time you did that it will solve everything. Obviously without success, right? We are now talking about 30 years of failure. So what you need is to create an organization that focuses on that failure and is very humble. It's saying, I'm going to attack that problem with different programs, see what works, see what doesn't work, scale up what works, engage with business, because if we don't engage, with all due respect, government and universities do not innovate. It is companies and individuals that innovate. Engage with them and try to see what happens. And as, by the way, we are successful, we expect new problems, right? It's one problem to start startups. It's another problem to figure scale-ups. Different sectors, different part of the country should have. So we need to create an organization that is very capable to understand what this program, but also know how to very quickly launch programs. And those programs, and that's the other thing, needs to be run in what I think the blueprint called the speed of business. Meaning, because we're talking about high uncertainty and risk for the business, if I approach CIC in less than 12 weeks, which is international best practice, I should have an answer. Do I get help? Yes or no? Not I do the R&D, and maybe 24 months later, after I paid consultant, God only knows how much.
If you pay the Shred advisor in advance, yes.
Yeah.
Very familiar with this process.
Okay, so you need an independent, and by the way, there's going to be a huge amount of failures. okay, in the programs. Both I will implement a program, it wouldn't do much, but also I'm going to give money to 2,000 companies or 5,000 companies every year, of which maybe 3,000 projects wouldn't do anything apart from creating the knowledge of how to do R&D and innovate, okay? So you need this independent from the political day-to-day, because the political day-to-day cannot face those kinds of failures. I mean, you're going to ruin your minister's career. Also, government, for very good reason. The public service is not where you can experiment and see what works and engage. So you need independence and you need the ability to experiment. And you should be humble and not say that, we are in Ottawa, we know everything that ever works for all of Canada. And the only reason it didn't happen in the last 30 years is because they didn't listen to me. I am the public servant who knows everything, that nothing was tried before me. Okay? Very humble. Here's the structure. Here's what is done. Here's 3 or 4 or 5 domains where we have seen other countries successful. That's sort of their programs. But now we created a structure that if we bring the right people in, they can start working on solving the programs hand by hand with industry. And that's a real difference. Apart from one, unlike other programs, the focus is making sure that that innovation stay in Canada and lead to prosperity in Canada. So built into each and every program are thoughts about how this stays in Canada, does not move to China or the US or Europe, and also the creation of a lot of intangibles, IP and the rest. And if it gets moved and you use public money to pay for that development, you not only have to give us back the money to Canadian, you actually have to pay a significant fine. And the reason is, which is very different from almost every other program, we are helping you, we are giving you public money in order to reach a public good in Canada. If you are reaching extremely high profits outside of Canada, that's great, but then give us back the money plus a fine because you didn't follow the agreement.
So you have kind of laid out very helpfully for me as a moderator and interviewer, kind of where we're going to when we're talking to the pillars of the CIC as we know it. So not only this is a crown corporation that is going to be led by the private sector, it is taken over or absorbed IRAP, the Industrial Research Assistance Program, as part of a broader mandate to, as you said, consolidate some of these programs. And I think when we put this podcast out in the article on BetaKit, we'll showcase the chart that the federal government has kind of laid out, indicating how these programs now all fit from the early stage BDC support for small businesses and entrepreneurs all the way up to, the hundreds of millions of dollars support. The CIC itself is going to kind of provide support between 50,000 to 5 million and go up to 20 million for large scale R&D. And then you just noted at the back end, I would think some relatively new information when it comes to the punitive aspect of either clawbacks or fines for companies that are not taking advantage of Canadian programs to have Canadian IP and I would say like taxable success remain in our country. Are there other elements right now of the CIC that you can speak to that have been decided that were not part of the rather limited announcement that came out about a month ago in terms of detail to shed light on here? And maybe how are your thoughts on how the program as announced so far has turned out relative to not only the other countries we were looking at as a model, but the initial intent when you got involved?
So one of the things you didn't mention, which I mentioned before, and I think it's very important, and that's also explained to a certain degree why we decided that within 24 months, not now, because you need to build a different DNA, IRAP will be merged into the new agency. The thing we learned from other countries is the speed. And the speed goes for two things. The speeds of decision-making, which needs to be very business and very technologically oriented, especially for what you call the small grants, right? the 50 to, a million.
Lifeline for companies.
Yeah, and this is not political. It's you give us suggestion to come up with a new product or improved product, which is exportable. And that's, one other thing we learned from is the focus need to be in export because you want to compete with the best in the world. And the only way you actually grow your economy is by exporting stuff. Okay. So the two things is technologically feasible. So you need people with a skill to, within 8 weeks, to decide yes, no. And B, if it works, should we expect it to be exportable? And again, you need those people. You need to reach a decision in about 8 weeks. So the whole process takes less than 12 weeks. And this is mass, right? This is without thinking. This is when the agency reach its final stage, right? It ramps up. Unlike programs that need to take 20 millions, this is, by the way, I'm not sure that the agency should even put 20 millions ever. But that's the CEO to decide. I don't know everything. So we have that option. But a lot of those grants to help those companies, because you need to kickstart, right? You need to have a massive change. The second thing we agreed on is that we are going to be agnostic about both sectors and areas. We are going to serve all Canadians. This is not an agency which is focused on a specific industry in a specific place. And therefore, one of the things that the team that will be there need to decide is whether it needs to develop or slightly tweak and tailor programs so they can fit specific industries in specific sectors. So if you want to help creating innovation around mining in the Yucatan, you will probably face very, very, very different issues in order to make that happen. But if you want a little bit more AI in downtown Toronto, or even Ottawa. Okay?
As listeners of this podcast will be familiar with these particularities by industry and the more traditional federal government approach when we talk about Bill C-18 in an upcoming episode, because as a media publication, I'm very familiar with that curated program by program approach with very specific conditions that are intentionally there, but then also create a strong barrier to anyone that it does not exactly fit the square peg that they're trying to move businesses through. So I think that's worthy of note. You keep talking about speed, however, and I'm wondering, this is something that has been promised since 2021, was announced in the budget last year. The story that we ran in August, that after the initial conversations that we had with you in the budget, was we don't have any details on this. There was a limited amount of details that we've kind of discussed here, announced last month. And they're hoping to maybe have this thing launched by the end of the year, possibly early next year. And I think, as you have noted to us, we might need to wait until 2029 to see any results from this program. Can you contextualize that within a conversation of speed? Because I think the average Canadian looks at that and they say, this is another government program that's set up to fail. They are adding bureaucracy. Most businesses started today won't exist in 2029 by the averages. How can you reconcile that and put it in a context that might offer a pathway for people to understand?
Sure. So I'll start with a good and then with a bad, and then we'll see why. The good is, if you actually, and as you said, you've been living in Ottawa for 8 years. Under COVID, and you might remember it was a small thing called the Freedom Convoy and virus, and the new government, from a decision to even allow a team in ISED and finance to think about this, to now putting the legislation and starting a new Crown Corporation in a year and a half, that's considered light speed in terms of Ottawa. Now,
in terms of Ottawa, or in terms of governments around the world?
Ottawa and government, exactly. Yes, it could have been a lot faster, but as you appreciated, we were told to do that. We started the team in ISED and finance that started to actually build it. And then you need to also converse with NRC and IRAP, those things just take time. This is government. So I think it was very fast, but that's exactly the point. And that's why you have very little details, because the idea is to create an organization that is actually fast. So if we, the the civil servants, and now I'm putting myself back into give very detailed programs, right? Bureaucratic programs, as you said, with a peg, and unbelievable lines, which says exactly what this organization needs to do. It would have taken us a huge amount of time to do that. It would have also probably be wrong, right? Because we don't know as well as what should do. But the other, it does not allow the organization to then have two kinds of speed. The speed to make decision, but also the speed to create and cancel programs, which is exactly what is different about this organization. So the organization and the details are on purpose limited, because the idea is to create an organization that focuses on the problem and come up with its own programs. And because it's a crown corporation, it's not 18 months, but again, assuming you get the right CEO and the right chair and the right people, and you really try to compete with peer organization, those peer organizations come up with new programs within 2 to 3 months. There is no legal way for you to be able to do that when you're inside government.
So it's point well taken here that we're not only talking about the launch of a new corporation, it's also an ongoing corporate merger with existing government programs, and this new corporation does not have a leadership body. To that point, I'm assuming when you were working to scope this out, it wasn't purely the workflow of a systemic approach and slotting it in. You must have profiled not only the type of work that would need to be done, but the type of leaders. Who do you think should be the CEO of the CIC?
Well, on terms of specific persons, that's not for me to say. But that person is a person that needs to have several qualities. One, she needs to actually know the business and what does it mean to do R&D. Not necessarily software and biotech, but R&D in our organization, okay? She can come from a software company, but preferably from a software company that actually worked with a traditional industry at some point, or have an engineering background in mining and then moving to software, okay? That's one. The second is a CEO. We talked about independence and speed. She needs to be able to come to a room with the leaders of a Canadian banking or mining industry or forestry industry or software industry and says, people, we have a problem. You have a problem, right? You need to innovate. You are the agents of innovation for our economy. And we need to get our act together. And here is what I think. Here's what you think. And now we're going to create programs together. And once we create those programs together, you need to do your job. And they will respect her. It wouldn't be a talking head from Ottawa. But on the other hand, she can also come. We know how politics works. And when there's a political push from the minister, the prime minister, or whoever is in, if it will be a new government. And she said, no, I'm sorry, Minister. This is a great idea. It might be very important for Canada. But this is not part of what this Crown Corporation do. This is not how it works. This investment might be a great idea, but if it doesn't follow the rigor of our research committee on whether it's technology feasible or not, this is not something that we are going to do. But not just to be an asshole, but to be able to explain in a language that Ottawa understand what is independence mean, why this is independence, and why this idea might be good, this idea might not be good. So somebody who can sit in both. In the ideal world, both the chairperson and the CEO can do both. In probably reality, you might want one of them to be able to know more of Ottawa, and the other is to be what some of my friends called red-blooded capitalist, right? But you need both skills.
There's a pretty strong checklist of people, without naming individuals, although I would absolutely love you to. When you list off this criteria, do you also have a list in your head of individuals in Canada who match that criteria and could take this on? Like, does this person exist? Or are we creating a savior complex here where we're looking for a superwoman to come in and lead an organization that we can't find?
So A, I think those people exist and there's a list. B, it does not necessarily need to be a superwoman who already accomplished that. It might actually be a much more humble and younger person who have shown the capacity and is willing to learn, because this whole organization is about experimentation. So you might not want to bring somebody who has been doing it for 50 years and is sure that what she has done for 50 years is the right way. But it needs to be somebody who people will respect. And we have a lot of, as I said, a lot of extremely successful, a lot of extremely educated Canadian from all of Canada. It does not need to be, yet again, somebody from Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal.
So as a follow-up to that question, and this is something that we've seen in other sectors of innovation, particularly fintech with open banking, that have created other systems where we need a czar to lead it. And qualified people are identified, but they're not necessarily exactly set up for success because of the pressures around this. And when you're describing a leader who would be able to go to the mining sectors and other sectors and be respected and have some leverage here, alarm bells are triggering here. What level of confidence do you have then in the government's capability to find and then appoint and convince this person to take the job?
So I would put it in different levels of difficulty. Finding a person is difficult, but that's very solvable. Convincing that person to take the job, I think this is a fascinating job, and you will find a few of the right people willing to at least engage with that. Now that I'm not in the federal government, the one frustrating thing about waiting, because we finished the blueprint at a certain point, waiting and not being able to...
At what point did you finish the blueprint?
Before it was announced, let's just put it that way.
Maybe around the time we were speaking to you last summer, would it have been around that time?
I was hit by a car. I'm serious. I was hit by a car in November, and I will claim that this accident has erased my memory of when exactly.
Okay.
Okay. But we had a few months. The problem with starting to talk to people, finding them, is that they wanted details. Is this a real challenge? And
is the federal government serious?
Is the federal government, and it was difficult. It was illegal to give them the answers that they needed until the announcement. So that's if there is any frustration in this, that's a frustration. But again, it's completely understandable. It's very political. You had IRAP. You can't tell the future CEO something that you haven't told the employees of IRAP. That's just the way life works. So I think we can. And I think we find them. I think we can convince them. I also think that currently there is a strong will by both ministers, so Champagne and Freeland, to get the right people in. I also think that if we get the right people in the first time, they create a DNA and a culture and a tradition of professionalism, which is exactly what happened in international agencies that worked. And those who fail, even with a right legal structure, they never got the right people and were not independent from the start, so they sort of mashed. So I'm hopeful. But the right people actually don't assume that Ottawa already knows about you, especially if you're not from Ottawa or Toronto. Make sure that you tell people that you exist.
Who are they telling? Are they emailing you, or are they just meeting up with Minister Freeland or Champagne? Like, now that you've come out of government, now that you are unmuzzled, as we might say, are you doing some headhunting recruiting? Are you on the list vetting committee?
I'm not on the list. I'm a private citizen, but I'll be very happy if anyone so wishes to pass their name. There'll be also a formal process because we're talking about government. So very soon there'll be an open, no matter how many we are looking for, right? And people are talking with informally or formally. At some point, there will be a process and the people will have to apply. Okay. And that process will be open and transparent. We are Canada. We are not other countries.
Well,
okay?
I have outstanding freedom of information requests that would disagree with that. But I would say also, to the point of your maybe when things get announced versus when maybe decisions are made, I think we're all hoping for a speedy process here and not a decision and a recommendation waiting for 6 to 9 months, like we saw with open banking for the thing to get launched. I also think it's worth noting here that it's very difficult to project the success of an organization that doesn't have leadership, that doesn't have culture, that's supposed to be operating in a private corporate environment. That's difficult. It's difficult for companies that exist to develop those things. And right now we don't have the leadership in place to set that. I'm wondering on the culture front, to this idea of the penalties for taking advantage of the program, but not keeping the IP or the taxable benefits here in Canada. How you feel that the culture of businesses that have been created in this country for the last 30 years will respond to that? Are we creating a incentive system that the federal government doesn't necessarily have the leverage to enforce here? Are we going to see companies just refuse to participate because of the requirements? What are your thoughts there? Because again, to your point, some of this is systemic, but the systems drive culture and experience and expectations.
Okay, so I'll start with the end. If you look through the history of successful programs, both industrial and innovation policy, you can look as far as even 93, 94, when the World Banks look at the Asian tigers, which are the only example of, poor countries becoming rich. Immediately it became clear that what they have done that other countries, Canada included, but mostly all of Latin America didn't do, is have both positive incentives like the money, but also discipline. So it's not penalties, it's discipline. We give you the money in order for you to reach those public goals. If you don't do that, you negate on your part of the social contract and there'll be consequences. But the consequences are not that high. And what do I mean by not that high? And let's talk about startups because it's easier, okay? If your real aim is to, you got $1 million from the CIC. And your real aim for the company was to get an exit of $50 million from some American company, say goodbye and buy a cottage in cottage country. Then the penalty, which might be, looking at something similar around the world, might be multiple of 6 of what you got, which will be 6 million, is significant enough that this exit might not now look favorable. So what you do is you don't prevent that exit, but you delay it until it's big enough. So when somebody is offering to buy you, a private equity company is offered to buy you in $1.5 billion, paying back 6 million, yes, of course you will fight it. But what it means is that the company, even if it's being bought, will grow enough in Canada that it wouldn't be moved lock, stock, and barrel to Boston or California, and would also start to employ people who are not just R&D engineers.
But isn't that just that incentivizing future branch plant economies after we grow and flower them? Why is the penalty not scaling with the size of the company? If companies can get to a certain point where they can absorb the hit, it's like we see this in the corporate world all the time, where the fines are completely outmatched by the benefits of ignoring the regulatory environment. Why not scale the punishment so that they can't sell out?
Well, because remember what we want to aim for in reality, not in the imaginary world. And then the reality is, as we said, a huge amount of companies are going to fail. Some companies will find that they actually need to be merged because they have one tiny product that they can't have a distribution. There's multiple good reasons why you might want some of your companies, or not all your companies, to be merged. Just look for a moment in the US and how many of those startups being bought. But they're being bought inside the US, but they're being bought, okay? So you cannot completely disregard reality. What you can do is, I will call it a delay game. I want to put it signaling device. The fine can be big enough, but the other thing that you talked about is, why would company take the money? So they would take the money because it's $1 million and they want the money and it's easy. And if they really aim to grow huge multinationals, they shouldn't care about that fine. If they already know that their aim is to run for 2 years and get 20 millions, Canadian taxpayers should not pay them the money. But when you sign that agreement, both sides needs to know exactly what are the conditions. You cannot sign an agreement with constantly changing conditions, because then and I used to have what is now called a startup, back when it was just called a software company, will never agree to sign anything with any investors where the terms constantly change against me. I would be very willing to sign, and you can see that in the literature and the research about it, to sign an agreement that says, okay, 6 or 10 times what you pay me if I move everything, half of that if I keep R&D and jobs in Canada. We need to put expectation, and we don't want draconian penalties. We want to slowly push the system so it thinks about more R&D and more R&D leading to prosperity in Canada.
Okay, so then I guess 2 questions here. One might be really quick. Just the New York Times just recently ran a story about the difficulties that the Israeli startup ecosystem is facing right now because of some additional government decisions. Seeing that happen in a country that was used as a bit of a model for this program, does that give you any pause, or do you see that as a reflection of maybe additional meddling beyond the scope of the program that we're talking about here?
So, without going too political, if you read about what happens politically now in Israel and you translate it to Canada, if we are going to face a situation in Canada where the government says that we are going to completely disregard the Supreme Court and change it, so politicians can just nominate any judge they so wishes whenever they want to, the Supreme Court is not allowed to debate new laws and states' decisions, and various other things about whether if your prime minister is standing to trial, whether he can or cannot. This is the politics we're talking about, whether or not you agree with him. If Canada ever moved to that political uncertainty and basically up to half the country going in demonstration, I would be shocked if there wouldn't be massive economic consequences, negative ones. Okay, so let's just put it in perspective.
But I agree. But to that perspective, some of the circumstances you described, we are currently seeing happening in the U.S., and we see Canada again as a trailing indicator, at least following along, maybe a not so optimistic process of our own. So, but again, that is a separate podcast. I appreciate that answer. The final question, and this is the real zinger that I want to hit you with, is of what was announced or what you know would be coming, or what is left for the new CEO of the CIC to be announced for her to decide, what didn't make it in that you think is a miss?
So I can think about one miss. We actually have learned from, without hurting the feeling of some of my colleagues, with the mess of BDC and the rollout of CIF. We have understood that if you want a new organization with a new culture and risk-taking, then giving it massive amount of billions of dollars and saying you have to ship that out the door in 1 year without even knowing how your program works, this is going to be a massive failure. So it's actually very important that this is, the budget comes up and up and up and up. Where I think we failed is to be visionary enough, aggressive enough, ambitious enough. And you look at where the government now think the status quo budget, right, for everything after the 4th year is, I don't think it's ambitious enough. So what I would have liked to do is to, we don't put a huge amount of pressure on the CEO to immediately ship up, $20 billion in 1 year. But I do want to be able to see that if the CEO, and not just the CEO, the whole organization improve itself, and there's a lot of demand for its services and grants, and you can see the needle starting, you actually will have, but in law, so there wouldn't be any political intervention, that the budget constantly goes up to match the demand from the private industry. And you look at other countries, it actually was in the law that the budget just goes up to match the demand until at some point it was clear that, this is so much money and the industry doesn't need it because there's now private sources of money. I think we're not ambitious enough on that, right? Looking 4, 5, 6, 10 years into the future. But again, this is politics. My assumption is we create a good organization. That organization prove itself. There's massive amount of demands from our companies, and the budget for a year is finished in 3 months. Only a really bad politicians will say, no, I'm sorry. We have the most successful programs here in Canada's history. I'm not giving you more money.
Yeah. Well, I think it is a fundamental truth that the one thing you can't systemically design against is bad politicians. But I appreciate your comments here. And I now understand why all my writers enjoy speaking with you and look to interview as soon as possible. I think we should end the conversation here and maybe look to have you on again down the road after you've been spending some time providing warm email intros to various ministers for this future CEO, and we can see the rubber hit the road. I greatly appreciate the time here and your willingness to step into the political arena for at least a small period of time to provide perspective and guidance. I
highly recommend to all my peers who really care and think they have the skills to help Canada to at least try. If you write an op-ed and you think you have a better solution than what's happening now, you should also be willing to come into the foray. It's a bruising experience, but do something about it. If not, please stop writing op-eds.
The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.